you. Good afternoon. Welcome all of you to yet another session again in this virtual AIOC. I thank all the speakers for joining in on time with us, and thank you all the audience as well for logging in to listen to us or listen to this power capsule on the common FAQs in clinical practice here. We have veteran speakers with us, well known nationally, internationally in their fields, and it's a privilege to have you all with me today. Thank you, Dr. Revati, Dr. Basak, Dr. Fogla, Dr. Rishi, Dr. Bhaskar, and Dr. Uma Sridhar. They all need no introduction here, and it will be Dr. Revati leading our show today with common concerns on the diagnostics and management of corneal ulcers or corneal infections. She's the head of the cornea services at the Aravind Eye Hospital Postgraduate Institute, Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu. Following her will be Dr. Samar Basak, renowned surgeon as well, head of cornea services of Disha Eye Hospital, who will talk to us on all the common FAQs and the doubts you would have in diagnosing and managing ocular allergy. Dr. Fogla again needs no introduction. He's a senior cornea consultant, a renowned surgeon as well, and something which we all look forward to is the FAQs in refractive practice. Rishi Swaroop will talk to us. He's from Swaroop Eye Center, the medical director and senior cornea consultant, will talk to us on the managing cataracts in corneal pathologies. Bhaskar from Shankar Nethralaya Cornea and Ocular Services will brief us on the all-important ocular chemical injuries, Sjogren's, SJS, OCPs, the ocular surface diseases per se. And to end it up will be Dr. Uma Sridhar from Noida Eye Care, who will brief us on the dry eye diagnostic suite and how it fits in today's clinical practice. I welcome Dr. Revati now to share her slides, and we'll move on to our first topic of FAQs.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Vanati, for putting up this very nice and practical subject. And it's very new format also. It's very nice, and that we are going to answer only the specific points here. Yeah. So my first question was, how to recognize and manage the MRSA keratitis. So this is the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus keratitis. And this previously we used to think it's a hospital-oriented infection, nosocomial infection. But recent publications have shown that even clinically associated MRSA infections are gaining more and more importance, and they are becoming more and more common. And it's very difficult to clinically distinguish between these two. And still the drug of choice is the vancomycin, and this is our data. And usually when we have to suspect the MRSA infection, nowadays MRSA, previously we used to think it's hospital associated. In any healthcare worker who comes with an infection which is fulminant, then we have to think about it. And now it's more and more, it's emerging as the most common infection in refractive surgery, post-refractive surgery infections. This is supposed to be the most common infection. And coming to our data, multi-drug resistant MRSA also can be there. Even among the MRSA, there can be more drug resistance. That's used to be 76%, and most of them are 100% resistant to all fluoroquinolone. So initially, when especially fifth generation fluoroquinolone, when they came in, they have been reported to be effective against even MRSA, but it's the thing is not, it's reducing gradually. So even now, vancomycin is the drug of choice in this condition. And another good news is the chloramphenicol is also showing a good sensitivity. Maybe it's not considered as a very fancy drug and not used commonly by the general ophthalmologist. And coming to management strategies in deep fungal keratitis and co-infection in fungal keratitis. Deep fungal keratitis, naturally, we have to look something else other than the topical drops. And here, generally, we'll go for intrastromal or intracameral injections. So logically, intrastromal, especially voriconazole, which is a dose-dependent, which has a dose-dependent action. So in higher concentration, it can become fungiciding. So intrastromal injection should be more effective, but the clinical reports, clinical studies, randomized studies did not show any promising answer for this, and they are not showing any advantage of intrastromal injections. Nevertheless, we try to give this injection in severe infections before going for a surgical intervention. Intracameral injection, again, amphotericin B is studied by AIMS group, and again they have shown it's not showing much of a advantage. One problem with amphotericin, it can cause significant fibrin reaction. So sometimes we won't even know whether the infection as such is increasing or the inflammatory reaction, toxic reaction. So intracamerally also voriconazole is more preferable than amphotericin B. Coming to oral antifungal agents, again, there are some studies. We did on ketoconazole because it's more effective, supposed to be effective against fusarium also, and also it's cost effective. Again, later with the MUD study 2, voriconazole also was studied. In both instances, we couldn't find any added advantage. Same way, Dr. Sharma, again, they have studied and they also didn't get great difference in the healing, but the better tear film concentration is seen with oral voriconazole compared to ketoconazole. And so we have to consider not only the cost and also the systemic side effects of these drugs when we are not sure about their efficacy. And coming to co-infections, the co-infections are not, the incidence-wise, it's not much, but they are gradually increasing. This is our own statistics, which showed the increase is gradual. And commonest co-infection is acanthamoeba keratitis, especially in contact lens associated infections. Fusarium and acanthamoeba often seen, not only from here, even from Europe, the reports are same. And but they are not behaving much differently in clinically. If you when we analyze the need for therapeutic keratoplasty is almost same in both group. We couldn't identify any specific clinical picture with which we have to suspect maybe a ring infiltrate. We have to suspect more. A confocal microscopy may be helpful, and maybe we can, whenever we suspect something, when the response is not good for antifungal, we can add PHMB because it's also having some antifungal activity and see. Coming to the management of Pythium and Nocardia, Pythium is no more a very novel infection. We got used to it very well. And we know that antifungal agents will not be effective here. So we have to go for some antibiotics. In vitro, they have shown good effect. And the clinical reports, they are not very promising. Relatively, they are better than antifungal, but antibiotics also, the results are not as good in these cases. So it's better to go for an early surgical intervention once this is recognized. And coming to Nocardia, you may be surprised why Nocardia is it's such a maybe I used to think Nocardia is a simple keratitis is a simple infection because easily you can recognize clinically and often it will respond to topical therapy. But one thing about Nocardia, it will behave like fungus. If they are exposed to steroid, then it will be very difficult to manage these cases. And that's why even in SCUT, we analyzed non-nocardia and nocardia infections because non-nocardial infections behaved very badly when we used steroids along with them. That we have to keep in mind when treating nocardia. Then coming to role of CXL, logically it should work because it has some antimicrobial activity and also it will make the collagen resistant to progressive melting. So it should be effective. It is supposed to be, there are reports that it is effective against bacterial infections, but coming to fungal and acanthamoebal infections, the clinical reports are not very promising again. Maybe people suggest that we should go for 2.5% riboflavin instead of the routine 1%. That is one thing. And another, the recent report from Bascom Palmer showing that using rose bengal as the photosensitizer RB-PDT is supposed to show better results than riboflavin PDT especially in acanthamoeba keratitis and fungal keratitis. Maybe we have to, the clinical study is already started or going to be started. So then we will get a good answer for this also. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Revati. I think that was an apt coverage on problems which we were looking at in with relevance to the current era. Something which I wanted to ask you is, how do you think is COVID impacting our practice of infectious keratitis?
Yes, obviously, like many patients are not able to come in time. And so many of them, they come with perforated ulcers. It's the number of perforated ulcers we see now is really more now when compared to non-COVID times. But still, one thing what I noticed nowadays, even antifungal agents are readily available even in the periphery also. So many of them are well managed by the local ophthalmologist. Many of them, of course, sometimes they will overtreat. They may combine antibiotic, antifungal like that, but they are trying to manage them, and then only whenever the patients are able to come, only they are coming. And another problem, even if you have a perforated corneal ulcer, it's quite difficult to go for therapeutic keratoplasty immediately. Sometimes non-availability of the cornea. And one lesson what we learned last time, accidentally we were having some glycerin preserved corneas. So they were of great help for us in treating these patients, and they are doing really well when we don't have any cornea. So this time we were prepared actually. Once this lockdown is about to come, previously only we stored some corneas, and we are still able to manage, address these cases.
Anything any of the other panelists would like to add on? Dr. Bhaskar, Dr. Basak, how you think cornea practice is towards our approach towards infectious keratitis is different in this scenario?
Like what Dr. Revati said, this time, the second time, we have become a little bit more wiser with respect to at least having tissues. The protocols in general also, the last year we were not sure what to do, GA, whether to do it under general anesthesia with so much of precautions, everything. Now at least things are a little bit clearer for in terms of diagnosis, in terms of management, and in terms of what we can do at least as a temporary process. Tinence patch grafts and all are options that are there if there is a shortage of tissue. You can do a scleral graft if there is an absence of tissue, and you can even take an autologous sclera from the patient's own if you want a slightly more thicker tissue than a Tinence to secure it. But these are thinking outside the box. Once you have gone through it, it is easier now to sit back and say, oh, these are the options. But last year we were struggling for answers.
So one concern which I think we are all looking at is there a higher incidence of occurrence of viral keratitis following immunization? Your thoughts on this? Dr. Fogla has joined us. Welcome, sir. Your thoughts on this? Any of you would like to put in your views and experience?
When you say viral keratitis, what do you mean? You mean to say corneal viral keratitis?
Yes. Is there a recurrence of keratitis in patients?
The problem that I'm facing currently is that often we see patients, even post-COVID, come back with symptoms which are pretty similar to nummular keratitis that you see post-adenoviral. And we are also seeing fresh adenoviral cases coming with preauricular nodes and submandibular nodes. So to differentiate between the two, whether one is something related to COVID or one is adenovirus, yes. I don't know whether clinically the treatment would remain the same for both the conditions. But patients do get worried because they read up about the association between COVID and conjunctivitis. So they want to get a test for COVID done, whether it can occur. So this is where I think maybe we will need to look at the rapid antigen test that we do for adenovirus. Maybe that will become effective if it can help us identify what is the infection that's causing the viral conjunctivitis.
So is vaccination also contributing to a higher incidence of occurrence of keratitis? Or is there any post-vaccination immune factors again? Yes, I think we don't have convincing evidence on that, though these are being voiced in several forums.
Excuse me, Vanati. One thing what I noticed more in more cases of PUK I'm seeing.
Okay.
It's like almost every week, 2 or 3 even new cases of PUK or reactivated PUK of previously well-controlled PUK. That I, even the last time also I was seeing.
Following vaccinations is what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So that's something which we
One
need
thing
to-
regarding tissue utilization, Dr. Basak had presented nice data yesterday showing that the iBank utilization rate had gone beyond 100%. And that's because you were
We all
using one
agree.
donor for
Yes.
multiple
We
patients.
find
So,
every tissue utilizable now
yes.
compared to how we used to be luxurious.
So I think
much
that's
earlier.
where
Yeah.
we have to try and conserve. We have to try and see how not to have wastage. So even in situations where tissues are not available, a lot of surgeons have used glycerin preserved tissues. And maybe if somebody could collect all the results, some general guidelines could be given on how to handle the tissue, because there are surgeons who have never handled a glycerin tissue, and now iBanks are giving them glycerin tissue. They call up and ask, how should I go about it? How do we, because the feel is different from a normal tissue.
Yes, I
When
agree.
handling passing sutures, it takes a little bit more effort. So these are things I think we need to write up. And
Yes. What are your words of wisdom, sir, when a beginner corneal surgeon handles glycerin preserved tissue?
no, you need to wash out the tissue to ensure that all the glycerin within the tissue has come out. So usually if you soak it in a bowl of BSS, at least for 15-20 minutes, that's sufficient time to allow the glycerin to come out. The tissue will look quite opaque. It will not look clear. And when you're trying to pass your needle, you will find more resistance. So that's normal. So even when you're putting your sutures, so maybe you may need to put more sutures to achieve a watertight closure, unlike a normal tissue which has some amount of elasticity that allows the wound to close. A glycerin preserved tissue, you may not get that.
So in this case, the 90 nylon is a better option, because you need to, because of large therapeutic mostly we are doing, and there the irregularity is always there. So 90 monofilament Niton is a better choice than 10-0.
Because sutures will break as the tissue is less elastic. When you try to tighten the suture to get the appropriate tension, you end up breaking the suture. So then what Dr. Basak has said, using 90 may make more sense. Yes.
Thank you. Now we will now move on. There's a small change in the schedule. Dr. Rishi will be taking on next, managing cataract in corneal morbidities. Over to you, Rishi. We can't hear you, Rishi.
Not clear, sir.
Am I audible now?
Not
You're breaking
clear,
in
sir.
between. You're breaking in between, Rishi.
Is this okay?
You can see your slides now. So your
Hello. Okay, great.
So please switch
Is
off
my
the video
audio
and start the presentation.
audible? My voice is audible? think you can move on to the next speaker.
So please check your internet connection.
Sir, you have bandwidth problem. Please switch off your video. Then the bandwidth is too much strong.
Okay. One thing, I think it might be better if somebody come in the end. I'll go to that.
Dr. Rishi, I think it's a network issue. I think it is because of your internet. If you can just switch off and switch on your internet and then rejoin the session, that might just solve the problem.
And we move. Is it sorted, Rishi, or do you think it would be best to move on to the next talk while you?
Ma'am, maybe it's sorted. So
Okay.
please share the screen.
Yes, please.
I'll come back to the end. I'll come back in the end. I'll come back to the end.
Ma'am, should we move on the next speaker?
Yes, I think we will move on. Dr. Basak, please.
Okay.
Sir? Yes, sir.
Yes, yes. I'm sharing my screen.
Yes, sir. We can see you. Your screen is just coming on. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Is it
sir.
all right?
Yes. Yes. You're visible and audible.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vanati, the lovely course. And I'm talking a little bit of ocular allergies. I do not have any financial interest to disclose. So there are certain questions are there. So all you know, allergic eye diseases are common and underreported, true or false? It is true. So there are several studies, including India, we know that it is increasing. Then majority of the eye itching arises from ocular allergy, true or false? It is false. The most common cause of itching is probably the dry eye. Next is which of the following is not a common cause of eye allergy, and you know that perfume is the answer. So in this category, which is not a major symptom of eye allergy, so gritty and dry sensation actually is not a symptom for ocular allergy. Individual who wear contact lens may use ocular antihistaminics to treat their eye allergy. The answer is yes, but they should give at least 15 to 30 minutes gap before wearing the contact lenses. So all you know this traditional classification. Some of them are IG mediated, some of them are mixed IG, non-IG mediated, and VKC and AKC is there, and GPC is there. So there are sets of symptoms, and you know that some form are seasonal, some form are perennial. So we have to look at this particular factor. GPC has a distinct characteristics, we all know that. And there are other ocular allergic disorders like contact dermatitis. Typically the patient presents with blepharoconjunctivitis, and notoriously the anti-glaucoma drug, atropine, and some of the antibiotic drugs, especially the neomycin, are responsible for it. And also the flectinolar keratoconjunctivitis, we often see from little poorer family group, and we know that adenoid and Staph aureus is the antigen is the responsible for it. And tuberculosis is also there in Indian scenario, because if you see multiple flick-10 or recurrent flick-10 having, and you should go for tuberculosis profile of the patient. So vernal conjunctivitis, is it a misnomer? Yes, it is a misnomer, because now we see that 60% of our patient of vernal conjunctivitis, it is perennial. It is not only in the spring. Literally, the vernal means spring. So there are other reports on allergic eye diseases, like air pollution is a big factor of increasing the allergic eye diseases, especially the PM2.5 level. And there are many studies from different countries, and you see that there are increasing number of papers are coming that air pollution is a contributed factor. And this is today's air pollution level right now, like 2 o'clock air pollution level in Delhi and Kolkata. Kolkata, we are a little better than in Delhi. Delhi, it is a little bit worrisome. So industrialism and the major development in other kinds of, they produces a lot of allergens. So that is a factor. On the other hand, people living in a rural area, rural farm, actually they get protection against allergic conjunctivitis. So there are some association with paracetamol exposure prenatally by the mother, and then the vitamin D deficiency and seasonal allergic conjunctivitis. There are good number of papers, lower plasma vitamin D and elevated total serum Ig level is associated with SSC. Then there are several similar articles are there. Now coming to this part is also important. We now know that conjunctivitis may be a presenting feature of COVID-19. Rajesh was just discussing with us. So the first question, is it or isn't it the allergic conjunctivitis in a COVID-19 world? So you should ask those. Now it is not so relevant question. It is rather if your patient might sometimes feel bad nowadays. So take proper precaution during examination. I think every setup has got a different rooms to see the patients with red eyes. So you have to be very careful. Then the impact of lockdown on ocular allergy during COVID-19 time. And there are two interesting studies. They have shown that the impact was moderate, and there was no major effect found on allergic conjunctivitis severity during lockdown period. And during pediatric teleconsultation, this paper from LV Prasad, and they have shown that the number one group of patient actually symptoms have allergic eye diseases. This figure, though physically we see between 18 to 41% in our regular OPD practice. Then impact of lockdown, definitely spending less time during the pollen season and wearing a mask in the outdoor reduces exposure to pollen, causes reduction of symptom. So these are actually very good effect, not only ocular allergy, other allergies also, cutaneous and respiratory allergies. So another question comes, lifting of lockdown, will it cause an increase in allergic conjunctivitis? Probably yes, because the people are in indoor environment, now suddenly they are exposed to outdoor environment with lot of PM 2.5 kind of thing. And another study, this is interesting study, though the study detail is not available, that babies born during lockdown are more likely to develop allergy. They didn't have given any kind of rationality, but the study is going on in Scotland, and they are studying the blood, different kinds of parameter markers, and they are suspecting that allergy probably will increase in this group of children in near future. So diagnosis is mostly clinical, but you can often do serum Ig inhibin and TRIg levels. And treatment, you know that all the mediators are responsible for allergic eye diseases, so you have to attack those mediators. So there is definite relationship between TRIg and specific serum Ig. There are many documents on it, so we have to give all form of appropriate treatment for this kind of allergy. So all of the above is your answer. So nasal steroid spray is also very important. So first line of treatment is allergen identification and avoidance. Avoid eye rubbing. Treatment of tear film dysfunction like cold lubricants. Then oral non-sedative anti-age histaminic, typically Montelukast. Dual-acting antihistaminics or mast cell stabilizer, the old one is still good. And treatment with coexisting rhinitis with nasal corticosteroid, that also helps to cure or give relief to ocular allergy. And second line, consider always preservative-free topical therapy if it is available. Then subcutaneous immunotherapy or sublingual immunotherapy. There are also, Nikhil was telling yesterday that even the epidermal or the intralymphatic. So multidisciplinary co-management sometimes required with ophthalmology, dermatologist, and allergy specialist. If you want to give steroid, because we see a lot of steroid-induced problem, today I have seen at least 2 patients self-medication, and so you have to use the low-depth retinal group of drug, and sometimes the subtarsal triamcinolone is important in this group. So third line is topical immunomodulator, either cyclosporin or tacrolimus, oral cyclosporin in extreme cases, and oral omalizumab in patient with concurrent asthma. So tacrolimus is, we know that it is highly effective in this group of children, but very short course, like 4 to 6 weeks. And also the immunotherapy, in few of our patients are getting immunotherapy, they are doing fine for a period of time. So there are certain indication, contraindications are there, but actually those are dealt with the skin or allergy specialist. The oral omalizumab actually helpful for refractory VKC where it is not effective. So take home message is allergic conjunctivitis is epidemic in 21st century. Individual susceptibility to allergens is most important. Air pollution, particulate matter less than 2.5 is important. More with urbanization and industrialization in recent years. Low serum D3 level is found in some individuals. Diagnosis is mostly clinical. Sometimes serum and TRIG level is helpful. Identification of allergen and desensitization are recommended. Systemic immunomodulation may help in some of the severe cases. Multidisciplinary co-management with ophthalmology and other specialists is important. Thank you very much for your patience hearing. Thank you, Vanati.
Thank you, sir, for a comprehensive overview on ocular allergies. Something which I wanted to ask you is, we have a lot of these anti-allergic medicines which are being pushed into the market. What is your preference, or what would you like to use over Bepostatin, Alcaptidin? What do you
So that's
think?
what the dual action antihistaminics is better. But recently we have seen that we are back to chromoglitide.
Yeah.
So that is also equally. So we are actually rejecting the old drugs, but they are most potent actually. Like
I think,
disodium chromoglycate.
Your mast cell stabilizers have a
very
definite
much,
role
very
when they are
much.
given long term in sort of bringing about an ocular surface quiescence in chronic allergy. I do agree, but I was seeing a little shortage of availability of these medications, at least
Right.
in and around Delhi, was what we had when I think companies were not focusing on bringing these into production. I think most of you would have also faced similar things. Anything else the panel would like to share on ocular allergies?
Oral antihistaminics that in the form of Montelukast or combination, they do better, especially if you give seasonally, say for 4 to 6 weeks, even up to 3 months. These children, they actually tolerate them well. There is no sedative effect, and they actually do better. But you see that digital device uses by the children has increased tremendously. So tear lubricant, especially cold, I always ask the patient to keep the teardrops in the refrigerator. So it acts dually. So this is important thing I want to share.
I think there's also another recent concept in management of chronic allergy is using 2 immunosuppressant therapies simultaneously, tacrolimus and the cyclosporin. What are your thoughts on that?
Actually, cyclosporin, like 2% cyclosporin is 2 irritants for these kids, and tacrolimus is also irritant.
Yes.
So I think only tacrolimus do magic in most of the
Absolutely.
and specifically if you give for 4 weeks, only night dose, that is sufficient. So cyclosporin 2% available commercially, but it is 2 irritants for their children eyes. So I normally do not prescribe dual, maybe 1 or 2 circumstances.
Yes, Dr. Bhaskar, you would like to add something?
Just to add on to certain things, Nikhil has got a wonderful paper in IGO where he has kind of graded the severity of allergy and given a stepladder in terms of
Yes.
what is the medication that you would want. So I would definitely ask people to probably go back and look at that article. When you have a VKC and you have a corneal component in terms of SPKs on the surface, you would probably still, or significant HT dots, you would still need a low dose steroid at least to kind of quiescent it. At that phase, none of the dual acting agents work. Dual acting agents work when it doesn't involve the cornea, when you are not having HT dots, when your allergy is milder. So in an institute, when you look at it, we probably get most of the severe cases, so we end up using steroids. But in private practice, if you have a corneal component, go over steroid for a short course, and then you can keep them on maintenance dose on a dual acting agent as such. Tacrolimus to that extent has been a wonderful agent in terms of a steroid sparing agent. Cyclosporin, I would second Dr. Basak's point that it is too stingy for most patients to use it. Tacrolimus also, between the brands, I do feel maybe Tacliment seems to be better tolerated than some of the other brands. No financial interests here. If they are not able to put it inside the eye, they could still apply it on the skin, which does seem to have a transdermal absorption and a local benefit, at least as far as the itching is concerned. And most importantly, avoid itching and rubbing, because then it can progress to keratoconus also if you are a constant eye rubber. So that's an important point here.
The other
I
point
agree
is-
with Dr. Bhaskar. Basically, sorry, Dr. Fogla. I always
Mhm,
give
sorry.
tacrolimus on the lids somehow, I mean, that seems to be more tolerated by the
patients. Yes, over the skin application is something in all intolerant patients, and it does really help in bringing down the ocular surface inflammation. The transcutaneous absorption is to a certain extent effective. Yes, Dr. Fogla.
What I wanted to say is, besides all the therapy that we have spoken about, I do spend a lot of time with the parents trying to help identify the source of allergen, which can be, so I think spending time and helping them, it has really helped some of my patients where they have to identify whether it's pets, whether it's related to, the pillow or the bedsheet they are using, or certain food items. They have to modify. It's not something you can find out overnight, but if you do that over a long period of time and you can find out what is the triggering factor, that goes a long way in managing these diseases, because the medications will work till you apply them. The moment they stop them,
Yes.
they have recurrence of
Come back
symptoms.
again.
Yeah. So even when they go on vacation, sometimes I ask them, if you go to a vacation, does your child's eye get better when he's not in the city? So these are somewhere they can. So I always ask them to maintain a diary, and whenever his eyes are good, just note down what is the change.
Right, absolutely.
Another point, Vanati, like sometimes a very severe epitheliopathy is there. It may be due to the drugs themselves.
Correct.
So
Yes.
sometimes you may have to stop all the medications, go for a preservative-free steroid, maybe a Decadron drops what you reconstitute and see, and then slowly again reinstitute other
Yes,
things.
yes. I completely agree with that.
And sorry to interrupt you.
We will just start
a
on-
reminder that our sessions will get over at 3:50.
Yes, Inasha, we are aware of that.
Yeah,
I
so
think.
accordingly,
Thank you
you
again.
can time discussions.
Yes. Yeah. Over to Dr. Fogla now for his talk on FAQs in refractive practice.
You're able to see my slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So it's a very basic presentation. The topic. sorry, it's kind of, let me share it again. Yeah, that should be fine. The speakers were blocking my screen, so I was not able to see my slides myself. So I had to minimize that. So the topic is frequently asked questions in refractive surgery for the general ophthalmologist. No financial interest in this presentation. So when we talk about refractive surgery, what are the options? The basic options are the laser-based options, surface ablation or PRK, LASIK, SMILE, or the lens-based treatment, either phakic IOL or a refractive lens exchange. So I will be concentrating on the first four. I'll be leaving out the refractive lens exchange. So when your patient is there for a refractive surgery, what do you need to look at preoperatively? You need to look at the visual acuity with and without correction, assess the refraction, if required, do a cycloplegic refraction. It's essential to look at the corneal shape by doing a corneal tomography preferably. Look at both the axial map, the anterior and posterior elevation, and the regional pachymetry. And most of the newer devices do give you some indices which tells you whether the topography map is normal or abnormal. And the abnormal values are usually highlighted in red. Look at the central corneal thickness, its location in relation to the center, whether it is displaced inferiorly. You evaluate the tear film and the ocular surface. Also dilate the pupil, look at the crystalline lens and the retina, especially the periphery, to look out for breaks or any weak areas in the retina. Also assess the ocular motility and the alignment to look for any phoreas which may be present. The laser-based procedures are usually contraindicated if you have an unstable refraction. That means in the past 6 months to 1 year, the patient has had change of glasses. You have any abnormalities in the cornea, especially ectatic disorders, thinning, abnormal sensation, or limbal stem cell deficiency with some vascularization, insufficient corneal thickness for the planned ablation depth. So if somebody coming with -8 and your corneal thickness is 500, definitely you may not want to consider a laser-based procedure. If there are any significant lens changes or coexisting glaucoma or uveitis, or any other uncontrolled external disease, just like we discussed, allergic conjunctivitis, somebody has that, or severe blepharitis or pre-existing severe dry eye, which will worsen after the laser procedure. So they may not be great candidates for laser refractive surgery. Any coexisting autoimmune or immune-mediated disease as well. And obviously, if the patient has unrealistic expectations from the procedure beyond what the procedure can deliver, then there may not be a suitable candidate. So once you decide that this patient is willing or fits into the category where you can do a laser-based procedure, an informed consent is extremely important, although the current data suggests that most of these procedures have a very high probability of successful outcome. It is still, on our part, we should inform the patient about the potential risk benefit and the alternatives that may be there among the various refractive surgery procedure. And also to emphasize the potential complications that may occur no matter how rare, and explain some of them which may be transient and some of them which can be permanent and result in loss of best corrected visual acuity. So basically, in the informed consent, the points that need to be discussed is the range of expected refractive outcome. Somebody coming with -10, and if you're doing a laser refractive surgery, the chances of a residual refractive error may be higher than somebody you're treating for -2. The limitation, especially with respect to presbyopia and the potential loss of uncorrected near vision, especially for myopes who are used to reading without having to wear glasses, it's important. If you are doing monovision, that also needs to be explained, and sometimes you need to give them a trial using contact lenses so they get to experience what monovision is. The various potential side effects and complications, whether sterile or microbial keratitis, the keratectasia which can occur in the long run, even night vision symptoms, fluctuation under low light condition, and the worsening or development of dry eye symptoms. And if the patient has a latent squint, sometimes that can become manifest. And if you're doing a procedure on the surface and patient has pre-existing epithelial abnormalities like a epithelial basement membrane dystrophy, there can be, recurrent corneal erosion syndrome which can occur. The option of doing simultaneous bilateral surgery versus sequential surgery also should be discussed, and the future impact on the predictive accuracy of IOL calculation during cataract surgery should also be informed to the patient. Looking at PRK or surface ablation, it can correct a range of errors in myopia ranging from 0.75 to -8 diopters, hyperopia up to 3 diopters, and astigmatism up to 5 diopters. You can remove the epithelium mechanically or alcohol assisted, or newer lasers have the trans PRK. And often the adjunct therapy is used with topical mitomycin C to prevent haze, often used for a 15 to 30 seconds duration. However, this is an off-label use because the long-term effect of mitomycin on the endothelium is not yet proven. Post-operatively, especially if you're doing a PRK, besides using antibiotics for a week till the epithelium heals, topical steroids, usually softer steroids, may need to be continued. At least in my practice, I continue them for 4 months to reduce the incidence of haze. Topical lubricants are also required for 3 to 6 months, as the corneal sensation takes 4 to 8 weeks to recover, and patients do experience some amount of dry eye during this period. With surface ablation, there is significant amount of discomfort in the first couple of days, so patients would require some pain relief medications. If topical NSAIDs are prescribed to manage the pain, then you need to keep a watch on the epithelial healing, because in the absence of complete epithelial healing, topical NSAIDs can lead to corneal melts. People have described using sunglasses post-treatment to reduce UV exposure, as that may have a role in inducing the corneal haze. Most patients undergoing laser-based procedure should be provided with a record indicating the pre-op keratometry reading, the refraction, and so this would be helpful in the future whenever the patient requires a cataract surgery and the calculation of the intraocular lens. Complications which can occur, you can get overcorrection, undercorrection. Sometimes over a period of time, you can have regression of effect. There can be some glare or starburst halo, especially while driving at night. With PRK, you can get early or delayed onset haze. So this is something you need to watch out, and you need to treat appropriately using topical steroids. You can get corneal infiltrates, melting, and if not treated appropriately, you can have perforation as well. Corneal ectasia, although has the lowest risk in PRK compared to the other laser procedures, can occur, especially if there has been preoperative corneal abnormality which has been missed prior to the laser procedure. You can have reactivation of herpetic keratitis. Topical steroids, if we are using it for a longer duration, we need to watch out for the side effects, namely the rise in intraocular pressure and any lens changes. As I mentioned, you can have an impact on the ocular alignment with the correction of the refractive error, which may require further treatment. Thinner corneas may require correction of the measured IOP, and this is more so if the patient has any associated risk of glaucoma. So you need to be able to measure the IOP correctly with calculation. If you are going to do a retreatment, they should not be performed until the refraction is stable or the corneal haze has resolved. And this is, we usually look at the corneal tomography or the topography for stabilization, at least 6 months after the primary PRK surgery. And retreatment, if there is significant amount of haze, one should be careful if you are doing a retreatment, because if the primary treatment has induced a dense haze, it is likely that the repeat treatment can also induce a similar haze. Mitomycin C application in that situation can help reduce the recurrence, the recurrence of haze. LASIK is more acceptable due to the absence of pain post-operatively compared to surface ablation. It can correct a higher range, myopia up to 12 diopters. Although in current clinical practice, I seldom go beyond 8 to 10 diopters, looking at the amount of residual stromal bed that is left behind and our understanding of the risk of ectasia. Hyperopia, although the laser manufacturer the laser is approved for correction up to +6 diopters, in clinical practice, we do up to +3, because higher than that, although there is an initial good outcome, but we definitely see a lot of regression. Astigmatism up to 3 diopters gives very predictable results, but the correction can be performed up to 6 diopters. In LASIK, the flap can be corrected using microkeratome or with the femtosecond laser. If you're using a microkeratome, you need to watch out for keratometry values which are either too flat or too steep, because if you have flatter corneas less than 40, you can have free cap. And if you have steeper corneas more than 47, you can have increased chance of buttonholing. And you should always watch out pre-existing epithelial basement membrane dystrophy, because sometimes with the passage of the microkeratome, you can induce a time's up. Okay, I think I'm going quite slow. So coming to LASIK, the post-operative treatment is the same. You use steroids for a smaller duration of time. Outcomes are quite good. Almost in this recent study on the patient-reported outcomes with LASIK, 99% had 20/20 or better, and in the other group, they had 96%. Complications are flap-related with LASIK, mainly epithelial ingrowth, interface fluid. You can have lamellar keratitis. So these are all the complications you should be aware of and you should discuss with the patient. Small incision lenticular extraction can also correct myopia up to 10 diopters. Here the advantage is because the flap is not cut, your corneal nerves are preserved, so you have a lower incidence of dry eye, and the outcomes are quite similar to femtosecond LASIK. Phakic IOL gives a correction beyond the range of the laser procedures. You can correct up to -20 diopters of myopia, 10 diopters of hyperopia, and 6 diopters of astigmatism. You need an anterior chamber depth of more than 3 millimeters and normal endothelial cell counts. The procedure is potentially reversible, so that's one of the advantage, and no impact on the dry eye. And the corneal aberrations are also induced or minimal. And they have seen in this study also comparing both high myopia as with laser-based and phakic IOL, the less loss of best corrected vision with phakic IOL. Complications potential with intraocular surgery. You can have endophthalmitis, endothelial cell loss, cataract formation, chronic inflammation, pigment dispersion, raised IOL dislocation. So this is in short about all the refractive procedures and what you need to know in your clinical practice. Thank you. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you, sir. And I just wanted to ask you one aspect here. So now I think people are looking on as post-plastic ectasia happening more rapidly in SMILE compared to LASIK. Do you feel so?
Yes, I think the assumption, what we started off thinking that because we always had an understanding that in LASIK, the flap that you create does not contribute to the biomechanical strength of the cornea. And in SMILE, because that anterior 130 microns is left untouched and you're not cutting the fibers all across, so an incorrect assumption was made that this is biomechanically superior. But with the actual procedure, so there may be other factors responsible which may be affecting the corneal biomechanics leading to ectasia. So it's just a matter of time. With longer follow-up, we will know. But definitely, yes, more and more cases have been reported. Even in our clinical practice, we have seen cases who have had SMILE presenting with ectasia.
I think your elaboration was very comprehensive, sir. And so now we will move on to Bhaskar to elaborate on the FAQs in ocular surface diseases. Over to you, Bhaskar.
I'll just share my screen. My screen is visible?
Yes, sir. It's visible.
So thanks, Vanati, for making me a part of this IC. So basically, when you look at dry eye or Sjogren syndrome, the common questions that are asked by common general ophthalmologists is, do you need to evaluate the dry eye in all patients? And what is the clinical tool that you would use to evaluate a dry eye? And do you need to actually get all these latest gadgets to evaluate dry eye? I would probably think a fluorescein stain is to a large extent sufficient to give you a reasonable amount of idea about the dry eye status. It not only gives you an idea about the corneal staining, but if you look at the tear meniscus height, you look at the pattern of breakup of tears, and you look at the flow of the tear film along as the lid goes up, it gives you a reasonable idea as to a type of dry eye and what is the severity of dry eye. So if you have gadgets, newer diagnostic tools, go ahead, use it. But if you don't have that, it doesn't mean that you cannot evaluate or treat a dry eye patient appropriately. The second question would be the need for a rheumatological consultation. Obviously, anybody with a Schirmer's less than 5 who does give history of joint pains, who does give history of dry mouth, should have an evaluation by a rheumatologist to rule out a coexistent rheumatological condition, because these patients, whenever they require cataract surgery or they require any other surgical procedure, you might have issues with their wound healing or post-operative inflammation. And in patients with dry eye, when you're tackling them for cataract surgery, you have certain other issues. They have an altered microbial flora, which could increase the risk of endophthalmitis or keratitis. You can have concomitant ocular surface inflammation. You might have issues with IOL calculation because the corneal surface is not so regular. You might have decide on the type of cataract surgery based on the visibility that the cornea offers. And again, when you're choosing the type of lenses, you will probably have to go for a monofocal lens, because multifocal lens in a dry eye patient is probably not advocated. If you have coexisting other issues like achilliasis or an issue with SLKC, you might want to address that whether with the cataract surgery or prior to the cataract surgery. Some patients do complain of dry eye features after cataract surgery, which could probably be a missed pre-existing dry eye, achilliasis, meibomian gland dysfunction, or the toxicity due to preservatives in the tears, or an incision site damage to the nerve as such. So preoperatively, a good examination, a thorough examination of the lids to rule out any causes for blepharitis, meibomitis needs to be done. You need to refer these patients to a rheumatologist for them to do what they call as the DAS28 ESR or the DAS28 CRP questionnaire and tell you that the disease is in remission or is in a low disease activity state. You don't want to operate on them when the disease activity is on a high scale. So if you have severe dry eye, obviously when your corneal surface is lacking luster, you might want to address that. In this case, we did a punctal occlusion with a cautery, and then once the surface gets stabilized or better, then you can go ahead and plan for a cataract surgery. Again, whether you want to go for a scleral incision or a corneal incision, the debate is still on. We've not generally moved on to a corneal incision. Suffice to say that your incision should be as small as possible, and the threshold for using sutures should be as limited as possible. I mean, you would want to use the sutures in case of any doubt. In the post-operative period, you would want to defer NSAIDs because there is a possibility of epithelial breakdown causing corneal melts as such. Use preservative-free medications as much as possible. Like I said earlier, if you have combined issues like achilliasis or severe dry eye, you might want to combine it with the cataract surgery. And if you have a PED, you have a thinning, you have a stromal edema, non-healing epithelial defect in a patient with Sjogren syndrome, you might want to send them back to the immunologist to hike up the systemic medication as such. Coming to the next topic would be Stevens-Johnson syndrome. What are you basically looking at is two things. How do you address the dryness, and in terms of lid margin keratinization, and the role of Pro's lens. As far as keratoprosthesis is concerned, it is basically when the surface is keratinized and you are not able to improve the vision with a Pro's lens, you are going to consider keratoprosthesis as an option. So coming to cautery, you have it as a very useful tool for severe dry eye. And the other option is to use scleral lenses, but then they are more expensive. A cautery is a very simple procedure, and even in a couple of days time post cautery, the surface inflammation significantly comes down. Yes, it can open up again, but if you have to redo the cautery, it's a very simple procedure. The next thing would be the lid margin keratinization. You can see the lid margin keratinization causing a blink-related microtrauma on the surface. The SPKs are directly coinciding with the area of the keratinization, and this needs to be addressed either by a Pro's lens or by a lid margin mucous membrane grafting. And this improves the patient's symptoms. It reduces the corneal damage, and especially if you have to plan any other intraocular procedure post-op, you need to address the lids before you go do an intraocular procedure. And just addressing the lids significantly reduces the ocular surface inflammation. You don't need any steroids in the early postoperative period. This is a patient who refused surgery initially and then came back after about a year with an increase in his haze and vascularization, then underwent the lid margin MMG, and then his vascularization also came down and his haze also came down. So just addressing the lid margin keratinization significantly improves the ocular surface health. Again, what is the age? There is no specific age. You only need to be sure that the oral mucosa has healed before you go ahead with the procedure if you feel that the lid margin is causing the abrasion on the ocular surface. If it recurs, what do? The answer is very simple. You can redo it. You have an ample source of lip tissue available, so it's not a problem as such. And sometimes you might need to do multiple procedures. You might need to do a cautery, you might need to do an MMG, you might need to do a cataract surgery, and then give the patient a Pro's lens. So you need to comprehensively look at multiple options to make sure that they have a reasonable visual outcome at the end. Coming to chemical injuries, the common questions is which classification to use, and how many times do you want to repeat an amniotic membrane, and how do you treat a grade 5 or a grade 6 DUAS classification. DUAS classification basically classifies it based on conjunctival involvement and corneal involvement, and it is important because it tells you whether the epithelium is there on the extent of epithelium which is there on the ocular surface. Now, if you look at a small corneal epithelial defect and much less of conjunctival defect, it might heal with a bandage contact lens and topical steroids. But if it is large and you have an you have a scleral line plaque or a corneal line plaque, obviously you need to do a surgical removal. When you look at a eye like this, which is a grade 6 DUAS, where there is almost fornix to fornix lack of conjunctival epithelium, there is lack of corneal epithelium, this would need multiple surgeries. You can do an amniotic, but when we have done amniotic alone in these eyes with severe burns, the number of times that we've had to repeat the amniotic has been huge because there is no source of epithelium to populate the ocular surface. So in these patients, more than grade 4 DUAS, we have started doing what we call as the alloslet in an acute chemical injury. The idea being to epithelize the ocular surface as fast as possible so that the further complications with respect to a corneal scarring, melting, perforation can be avoided. Again, when you look at the previous photo and this photo, this with a scleral ischemia is much worse as compared to the previous photo. So even though both are grade 6 DUAS, you probably require a lot more surgical intervention in this patient as compared to the previous patient. Again, when you have a melted cornea, it still comes under grade 6, but the prognosis obviously is worse as compared to the previous two images. And when you have such a severe Tenon's ischemia, then you would probably want to combine it with a tenonplasty and an amniotic. And this patient actually ultimately required a keratoprosthesis. And even though he got back 6/9 vision, but it's multiple surgeries and a lifelong follow-up that he has to undergo. Now, the next question is, when would you want to do a stem cell transplant? You would want to do a stem cell transplant only once the eye is significantly quiet, and minimum is around 6 months post the acute injury. Sometimes post amniotic in the acute patient phase, patients come back with decrease in vision, haze, and you can see the stippling on the surface. There's no urgency to rush for a repeat procedure or a stem cell at this point of time. Just give it time. The surface epithelium heals and it smoothens, like is seen in this patient. It is seen again in this patient, where over a period of time, by just observation and lubricants, the surface quietens. So you don't have to rush for doing a stem cell transplant in an acute chemical injury. Again, another patient where you can see the staining pattern of the epithelium at the 1 month post injury, and then at 2 months, and then at 6 months. So it definitely shows an improvement gradually as you give time for the epithelium to remodulate. Coming to OCP, how would you identify the disease? How would you monitor progression? When would you start a systemic immunosuppression? These are the commonest questions. Obviously, you would need to look at fornicial shortening, repeated episodes of inflammation, monitor the fornicial depth, take serial photographs to document it. If you have ruled out other causes of cicatrizing conjunctivitis and you're very much sure that this is OCP, you can confirm it by doing a conjunctival biopsy. But even if your biopsy is negative, doesn't stop you from starting the patient on systemic immunosuppression, because the treatment for OCP is systemic immunosuppression. So, and if you're doing a cataract procedure or anything, you would need to address the dryness, you would correct the lids, you would put the patient on systemic immunosuppression to control the disease. And then when you're doing a cataract surgery, it would be preferable to do a corneal approach as such. When you're talking about cataract surgery with pterygium, the questions are, should you do it together? Should you stage it? So basically, if you have a less than 2 mm pterygium, you can do it together. If it is more than 2 mm, you would want to do it as a staged procedure, but obviously it involves a discussion with the patient as to what the patient expects at the end of the procedure. What is the ideal duration between a pterygium surgery and a cataract surgery? We do not have very great guidelines, but approximately about a month, allowing time for the keratometry to stabilize would be reasonable. So if you have a small keratometric error, you could probably combine. If you have a high cylinder, it was preferable to do a staged procedure. If you have a post-pterygium astigmatism, which is reasonably regular, you might even consider doing a toric lens. Something like this, it's difficult, but you can still manage it with an amniotic, with a split conjunctival graft. But something like this requires multiple surgical procedures. It would be better to refer it to a person who's well-trained in ocular surface reconstructive procedures. Last but not the least, somebody who presents with irritation, foreign body, mild redness, photophobia, take your time, just lift the upper lid and look at the upper tarsal, upper bulbar conjunctiva. This congestion is very typical of superior limbic keratoconjunctivitis. And if you treat that, the patient is going to be a lot more comfortable. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhaskar, for that wonderful overview. And as Uma is setting up her slides, I think we'll take up questions on this together. And as Umar is setting up, can I ask you one thing, which I think most people do ask is, how would you go about deciding putting a punctal plug in a case with dry eye?
So we've actually, in SN, we've almost stopped doing punctal plugs. We prefer the punctal cautery. We do the evaluation of the dry eye. If the Schirmer's is consistently less than 5, we also do the fluorescein clearance test, whereby we all look at the stimulation. That is, after the nasal stimulation, how much of tears are increasing. If even the reflex secretion is less and the Schirmer's is consistently less than 5, we prefer to go ahead and do a punctal cautery rather than a punctal plugs. The benefit that we have seen with a punctal cautery, we have not seen that with the plugs. With punctal cautery, if the patient requires it, you do it today, next day morning, the patient is going to be significantly much better. The surface is going to be much more smoother. The surface inflammation is going to be much lesser. That we never saw when we were using the Herix plug or some of the other plugs. We use the plugs only if the patient is very reluctant to have a definitive procedure as such. As a stopgap.
Sorry, Bhaskar, do you use Elman cautery or bipolar?
We use the battery cautery kind of thing with the image that we showed. It has a loop cautery.
Because when we use the bipolar cautery, it opens up actually after a while.
The loop one needs, whether you use a bipolar or you use a unipolar loop battery cautery, the idea is to basically char it significantly and then come out. The problem is if you don't char it completely, it kind of recanalizes. Again, when you're getting the cautery tip out, if the plug comes with the cautery tip, that means it's probably going to open up. You need the eschar to be there so that the epithelium will grow on top of the eschar and not on the canalicular area.
Thank you, Dr. Bhaskar. And now it's over to you, Uma, on the common FAQs on the dry eye suite.
Thank you, Vanati, for inviting me in this. So one thing is sure, dry eye is a diagnosis and not a symptom. Whenever you ask the patient what his symptoms are, he'll say, I have dry eyes. Now, is the question, a few just introductory questions. Well, patient usually asks, if I have dry eye, why is watering a symptom of dry eyes? So when the ocular surface is devoid of protective layer of film, the tearing occurs. And the other symptoms are grittiness, foreign body sensation, tiredness, blurring vision. What questions do we ask relevant in diagnosis? This is for the general ophthalmologist, when you just have 5 minutes of chair time or 10 minutes. So what are the things that you keep in mind? One is age of the patient. The more the age, dryness is more common, but you can't say that younger people do not have dryness. Contact lens wear, type of contact lens, number of hours of wear, occupation of the patient, especially the IT group, hours of screen time, smokers. Added points in this pandemic is the work from home. That patients say they work 15 to 16 hours in front of the computer and then the Netflix and other things. Then online classes in children, and the mask-induced dry eye also is very common. And also you can ask about systemic diseases like thyroid, diabetes, collagen vascular, graft versus host, allergies, atopy, acne, rosacea, SJS and OCP. Then these are the causes of sensory loss which are there, which we have to keep in mind. And the systemic medications you can generally ask are the antihypertensives, beta blockers, diuretics, antidepressants, anticholinergics, antispasmodics, hormone replacements, and antihistaminics. Also, history of ocular surgery, refractive procedures, and cataract surgery is important. Now, the frequently asked questions are how to diagnose a dry eye, how do you know what kind of dry eye, is it aqueous deficiency, evaporative, lid-related, what are the relevance of investigations, and when do you ask for systemic investigation? So in the clinic, what do? You take history, age, symptom, occupations, medication, drug reaction. What is the questionnaire they would normally like to use? There is the OSDI, there is the symptom assessment, and there is the speed questionnaire. The speed is the fastest. You can see that in each category, there are just 4. So it's quick and occupies less of chair time, and the patient can do the ticking. And then these are the questions in the DUCE classification, which we have already gone through. Now, systemic examination, important to see the patient as a whole and not just his eye. So if you see if he has facial palsy, decreased blinking, blepharitis, anterior, posterior, meibomian seborrhea, the ocular surface, the tear meniscus height, symblepharon, we miss often and miss the OCPs there. Signs of burnt out trachoma still there, and vitamin A deficiency. So when you see in the OPD, you can see the debris in the tear film. You can put a drop of fluorescence, see the tear lake, see the T-bud, and surface staining. And you can develop a particular algorithm. I prefer to put a drop of fluorescence, see the T-bud, and then at the same time do the Shermers and the fluorescent clearance. So what is the role of the dyes, the Lissamine green and the rose Bengal? If you have them in the OPD, you can see that the ocular surface central staining is because of tear deficiency. And when it is towards the phonesis, it's mostly the meibomian gland deficiency and evaporative dry eye. And you can also, the von Westerveld scoring, you can do the scoring for this. Now, which Shermer's test would you do? 1, 2, or 3, like Dr. Bhaskar said, and what we were taught in fellowship, Dr. Sangwan's favorite, Dr. Subota, that you stimulate the nasal, due to nasal stimulation, when you find that that distinguishes the Sjogren's from non-Sjogren's. So the reflex tearing is actually absent according to Subota in Sjogren's syndrome, and in non-Sjogren's you might find some reflex. Fluorescent clearance test, I do set a great store by this. That is, when you do the Shermers, after putting the dye, you can see if the tear turnover is there or not. Dr. Swati Singh from LVP has done this new test of touching the dye to the lacrimal gland. And if you see the secretions there, you know it's not a cicatrizing disease, and it's actually a decreased secretion. So we find in case of SJS and all, there is a secretion of tears, but then the ducts may be cicatrized there. So the Shermer's test, we can see that, sorry. Okay, now when do you go for more expensive tests? And are these tests diagnostic or prognostic? And what do we have by the way of diagnosis? Now, if you have the expensive tests and of course you want to use them, they can be both diagnostic and prognostic, and you want to tell maybe the IT group and the patients who are very intelligent and educated, you want to tell them that this is what you are having and you have to reduce your screen time. So if you are suspecting, what we do, we have both the ocular surface analyzer and the LipiView. I think a problem of plenty. So we need to use both, but which one to use when? So I would say, and some people would say, just we do only the autoref to see the meibomian gland since we do not have the OSA and the LipiView. We prefer to do the LipiView when we suspect a meibomian gland disorder. And when we see an aqueous deficiency, we prefer to do the OSA. But then again, what does the LipiView do? What do we get from it? We get the lipid layer thickness, we get the number of blinks, we get the number of partial blinks, we get the pattern of the lipid layer, the interferometry, and we can also analyze the meibomian gland dropout. So we have done 2 studies here, one after glaucoma medications to see how the meibomian gland dropout happens. And we did see that with Xalatan and primary glaucoma, we did find meibomian gland dropout, especially in certain areas. And also we did some studies and after entropion and ectropion surgery to see what happens to the meibomian gland. So that is pretty useful here. We do that, and you can see a brief video of the LipiView here. Yeah. The video opening, yeah. Coming to, yeah. You can see the LipiView. You can see that the number of blinks you can see there. You can see the meibomian glands also. You can see the areas of dropout. So
we can't see your video, Uma. You
couldn't see? Okay. I'll just try to play back that. Yeah. Now could you see, Vanati?
No,
it's playing on my screen.
Yeah, no, the link is not working on the.
It's not? Okay. Okay. So what do I do for that?
I think you can just go ahead here.
Sure. So you can see this, one of the printouts of this. You can see that the LLT you expect over 60, 65 to be normal. And this is 44 and 36. But one thing which has to be remembered is the patient should not put any drops, and this should be the first examination that is done in the day. So, and then you can also see how the glands are. You can see both in the infrared, you have also the dynamic viewing there. You can see the loss of the glands. So the patient understands that they are using the screen time is far too much. What do we get from the OSA? We get the tear meniscus height, we get the lipid layer thickness, we get the non-invasive breakup time. We also get the percentage meibomian glands loss in all 4 lids. So here you can see, not very clear maybe, the NIBUT, the lipid layer, the tear meniscus height, the meibomian gland percentage loss, upper lid, lower lid, and the dry eye, how much is it? It is like a traffic signal. So anything in red is dangerous, anything in green, very good, and in yellow, you have to be a little careful about that. So here you can see the NIBUT here, 11.7, 11.4. Anything more than 10, very good. You can see the lipid layer type, the meibomian gland percentage loss in the upper and lower lid. I hope this video plays, I'm not sure. Just showing the OSA. Can you see? No. Is it visible? The OSA video?
No, the video is not playing.
Oh, okay, okay. Right. So this is the, sorry for that. This is the, okay. The other tests that we have are the tear osmolarity and the Infema Drive, which tells you the MMP9. The tear osmolarity, we had a demo machine for some time, and then it might tell you if the osmolarity is very high, then, but these are very expensive tests and adds more and more to your patient expenditure, which they may not follow. The Infema Drive tells you whether the MMP9 is increased or not, and there is inflammation on the ocular surface. And when do we order some blood work? We have missed patients with Sjogren's syndrome. So you do this anti-RO and LA, also ANA and rheumatoid factor, sometimes vitamin D3 levels. So all these are mostly in secondary Sjogren's syndromes and aqueous deficiency dry eye. And as Bhaskar said, we need a rheumatologist and a physician support because they usually start pilocarpine, sivamyline, and other secretagogues, which may help to increase the tear production. It's also important to grade the dry eye as mild, moderate, and severe. And the severity level will be also on the visual symptoms, staining, and the lid, meibomian glands, T-bud, and the Schirmer's. The treatment, I think this mainly covers only the diagnosis. So the treatment depends upon the type of dry eye, the severity, and also, like Dr. Fogla said, you need lifestyle changes. And I don't think my seminar is supposed to cover the lubricants and how much, but the different types are CMC, HPMC, gels, and ointment. In the mild, all types are okay because minimally you use 4 times a day. Moderate, you use them more frequently and lesser preservatives. And severe dry eye, you use preservative-free. So the other medications that we have are the Trihalos, the Rimabepide, the UV loop, and the Xiidra, which is not available here. But the Xiidra is mostly when the ICAM levels are high. IL-6 levels being high, you use cyclosporine. You can use it for a year, year and a half. Omega-3 fatty acids may also help. So also vitamin D3. And the importance of maintenance, it's a treatment, it's not a cure. And the patients have to be explained the disease. Bhaskar has already covered punctal plugs. And I think the topic is beyond whether it's a thermal pulsation or IPL and when to do that. Thank you, Vanati. Sorry that the videos didn't show actually. Yeah.
Uma. So that was a comprehensive overview on how the dry eye suit can fit into your practice. One question to you, Uma, is of course, with all these sophisticated instrumentation in a dry eye suite, we can show the patient on serial follow-up on how their tear meniscus height, their NIVUT, how all these is changing, or what is the effect the treatment is perhaps having on their eyes. Besides this, how do you think mammography is helping in your decision making on taking a patient for management of their meibomian gland dysfunctions?
If there is if there is a major loss, if there is atrophy and loss, then your IPL or lipid flow is not going to help. If the meibomian glands are still present, then and they are not secreting much, then your procedures will help. So if the patient has to be advised that before they lose the meibomian glands, if there's a lot of dropout, and before the dropout happens, you have to treat these patients. Excess dropout, there's no point basically.
What's the cutoff you would like to look at the percentage damage before you would recommend a solid treatment for these eyes?
I wouldn't try to guess, but if it is less than 20%, I would say, well, not a great this one. I don't know if I don't have too much experience with lipid flow. It's very difficult to get the patients to actually, it's an expensive procedure.
Yes.
So you usually start them off with a mask or with the hot water fomentation, see how the benefit is. And if they are really bad, kind of this one. And also in patients where there's a lot of cheesy secretions and all, they really benefit from this. If there's altered secretion, cheesy secretion, then these patients really benefit. But if you have a lot of gland dropout, then, and LipidView does not tell you the percentage dropout, which the OSA does, I guess. So, this only, and also there can be a lot of fallacy. If you put a drop and come, your LLT can be even 100 nanometers. So you shouldn't have any drops in your eyes. So that's a bit.
That's true. Your views, Dr. Bhaskar?
Basically, One is looking at the anatomy of the meibomian gland to show that the glands are present. But sometimes if you have a very thick inflamed conjunctiva, the glands might actually not be picked up even on the keratograph or the imaging machine. The second would be to physically press the lids to see for the amount of glands which are secretable and the quality and the quantity of secretion which comes in. If you are not imaging the glands at all, and when you're pressing the lid also there is no secretion which is coming out, which basically means that the meibomian glands have already got atrophied and your openings are already blocked, so there's nothing which is coming out, then obviously there's no benefit of LipiFlow or IPL and things like that. If you are imaging the glands, but your secretion is a little bit cloudy, then yes. What we do in SN is like it, because it is an expensive tool, we normally first ask them to do the hot fermentation. And when we call them back about a month or 2 months, we ask them, did they feel better with the hot fermentation? If they say yes, even 20% better or 30% better, then we would say, okay, fine, we can offer this. This might actually improve your comfort a little bit, and you still have to continue doing the hot fermentation at home. It doesn't stop you from doing it, but maybe your benefit you might get is a little bit longer lasting as such. When you have a severe ATD component along with an MGD, it probably doesn't work. It works more when you have primarily or an exclusive MGD disease. So to that extent, if you're looking at a computer vision professional where your Shermers is good, but they are very unhappy with the drops, or when they're getting too tired with working on the system, those would be the candidates where I would feel that it actually makes a difference in terms of their comfort level, because they are also, again, people who don't want to be putting hot fermentation for 10 minutes and sitting. They would want something much more comfortable, one time kind of a treatment as such. So there you would probably offer LipiFlow or IPPL, and then ask them to monitor their screen time and make sure that they blink and stuff like that.
Dr. Samar, you would like to add on something?
Yeah, we have LipiFlow system in 2 places, and we are not expensive. In fact, Johnson & Johnson, when you use their lenses, because they are now the market leader, so they club the activated system with you, even the machine with you. So it is not at all expensive. So Uma, you can send your patient to us. I'm telling you, the cost will be less than to and fro airfare plus the
Really?
flow charges.
That's nice, sir. That's good.
So basically nothing to gain, but I have myself done it. In our hospital, we did survey, and about 40% of our ophthalmologists have significant gland dropout areas. And when we offered them to go for LipiFlow, and including me, I have done almost 2.5 years back. Still, I am doing fine, better than before. But now I know that probably I need to repeat it within next 6 months. The literature says that you need to repeat it between 2 to 3 years. So nothing is wrong. It is because nobody has time to go for hot compress and very religiously every day with all the sodium bicarb, etc., etc.
Delhi patients are different, sir. They prefer to do the hot fermentation to spending money.
Okay,
So
that is fine.
they are like that.
So is there anything else which our panelists would like to ask? Anybody else want to share their views on any of the concerns which we discussed today?
So basically the MGD will stay and probably will increase. Now we have a group of patients, those are very, very young, like school goers. And those we are getting because of lot of use of digital devices. So we see a lot of changes in this meibomian glands themselves. So at least 10% of them. So we are having everyday LipiFlow about maybe 25, 30, and among the different age group. And we feel that this whole indoor system and digital system actually killing the meibomian gland for some, because you are not blinking, so it is that way.
Actually, that's what I wanted to ask, sir. We are seeing many children with the MGD features. So how do you suggest to?
So blink habit, blink habit we have to reinforce. We talk to the parents, and they often, after the clinic school hours, they all the time, they do not actually open their books nowadays. All digital, either mobile or tab or laptop during school hours. So you have to tell them categorically that, see, 8 hours screening time is good enough, but the rest of 8 hours, you must go through your physical book. That is the only way. And I always advise them to conscious effort of blinking. That is the only thing you can add upon. Because
Not only
lead
that,
hygiene is otherwise good in this.
even if they are not going outdoors, they may have actual vitamin D deficiency starting from a
Yes.
very young
Yes.
age.
That is
And
also.
that may play a role in the meibomian gland health as well.
Yes.
And also the dietary changes as well, because, you know, parents are also busy at home. So I think they are not getting the enough, even from the diet, they are not getting the nutrients or the vitamins which are required. So I think all that has a play in meibomian gland functioning and development. And as we know that when meibomian ducts get blocked, it does lead to atrophy of the rest of the gland because of the block. So that if it persists for a longer period of time, and in recent times, especially with the use of masks and increased work from home, we find almost every out of 10 teleconsultations that I do, 7 or 8 are all related to malaria on
Sorry to
staff.
interrupt you, sir. I think the time for the session is,
Yes,
we
yes.
can just conclude it now.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I thank all my speakers for taking out time this Saturday afternoon to be with us, and I thank all our audience as well for logging in. Thank you so much.